The nurse had worked 12-hour shifts at Callaway Bay Medical Center for 6 years without a single commendation. She filed her paperwork quietly, argued her cases carefully, and never once raised her voice, even when the doctors talked over her like she wasn't standing right there. So when Director Gerald Foss had security escort her out of the building in front of the entire emergency department, nobody moved to stop it. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. She picked up her badge, her bag, and her worn coffee thermos, and she walked out. 40 minutes later, when the harbor exploded and the building filled with dying sailors, the only person in the city who knew how to stop the bleeding was standing in the parking lot. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes quiet people are worth paying attention to, follow my channel right now, like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. The morning Nora Vass got fired, it was raining. Not dramatically. Not the kind of rain that shows up in movies when something important is about to happen. It was the thin, miserable kind that couldn't quite commit to being a real storm. It soaked through your jacket collar and made the parking lot smell like wet concrete and old cigarettes. Nora noticed it because she'd been standing outside Callaway Bay Medical Center's main entrance for 3 minutes before she remembered she'd left her umbrella in the break room 2 weeks ago and never gone back for it. She thought about that umbrella a lot over those 2 weeks. Thought about how going to retrieve it would mean walking past the supply closet where Dr. Aldrich Fenn kept his personal parking permits, past the administrative bullpen where the billing coordinator, a mealy-mouthed man named Sutter, had once told her that nurses who asked too many questions had a tendency to find their schedules reorganized. She'd thought about the umbrella and decided it wasn't worth the trip. Now she was wet. She pushed through the sliding glass doors and nodded at Marcus, the overnight security guard who was technically still on shift for another 20 minutes and who always looked mildly relieved to see her. He was the only person in the building who said good morning first. "Looking rough out there," he said. "It's fine," she said. "How was your night?" 2 drunks and a broken vending machine. Living the dream. She almost smiled. Almost. Then the elevator doors opened on the 2nd floor and she stepped out into the controlled noise of the emergency department at 6:47 in the morning, and whatever small warmth she'd gathered in that brief exchange with Marcus immediately dissolved. The ER at Callaway Bay was the kind of place that made people think hospitals were dramatic. It wasn't. Mostly, it was fluorescent and tired and smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold food from the vending machines 1 floor down. The drama came in short, violent bursts: a trauma code, a cardiac event, a mother screaming in triage, and then settled back into the long, grinding grind of paperwork, reassessment, and charting errors that somebody had to catch before they became patient incidents. Nora caught most of them. Not because she was assigned to, not because anyone asked her to. She caught them because she read every chart that came through her section, and she had a memory for dosages and contraindications that made the younger residents quietly uncomfortable. She'd heard one of them once, a 3rd year named Paulin, tell another resident that Nora was one of those nurses who thinks she went to medical school. He'd said it like an insult. She'd filed it away under things that were true and irrelevant and kept working. She pulled up the overnight handoff notes at the nurses' station and started reading. Bed 4, 63-year-old male, chest pain, already worked up and waiting on cardiology consult. Bed 7, pediatric laceration, repaired and discharged at 0300. Bed 11. She stopped. Bed 11. She read the note twice. Then she pulled the chart itself, the actual paper chart in the plastic sleeve hanging from the foot of the bed, even though the patient in bed 11 had been discharged hours ago, and the bed was now occupied by a 50-year-old woman with a kidney stone who was very loudly not happy about waiting. The note in the discharge file for bed 11 read, "Patient presented with symptoms consistent with mild chemical irritant exposure. Treated with supportive care and discharged. No reportable incident." Nora stood there for a moment, reading that sentence again. No reportable incident. The patient in bed 11 had come in 2 nights ago. She hadn't been on shift, but she'd reviewed the chart because bed 11's charting had been inconsistent for the past 3 weeks, and she'd been trying to figure out why. The patient was a 19-year-old naval apprentice who'd been brought in by 2 men in civilian clothes who'd identified themselves as his supervisors. His intake vitals showed a heart rate of 118, respiratory rate of 22, and his initial oxygen saturation had been 91%. The triage note from that night described possible inhalation irritant and flagged it for hazmat protocol review. That flag had been removed from the chart. Not overruled, not documented as reviewed and cleared. Removed. As in, if you didn't know to look for it, you would never know it had been there. Nora set the chart down carefully. She took her phone out of her scrub pocket and took a photograph of the discharge note, specifically the timestamp and the attending physician's signature at the bottom. Dr. Aldrich Fenn. Of course. She'd been collecting these for 3 weeks. Small things. A flag removed here, a dosage adjusted there in the post-visit notes, a pattern of certain patients, all of them connected in some way to Callaway Bay Naval Research Harbor, 2 miles down the coast. Getting discharged faster than their presentations warranted, with documentation that was technically complete but somehow always a little thin in the places that mattered. She didn't know exactly what it meant yet. She was a nurse, not an investigator, but she knew what clean documentation looked like, and she knew what scrubbed documentation looked like, and these charts had been scrubbed. She was still standing at the foot of Bed 11's current occupant, who had now noticed her and was giving her the look people give nurses when they want to register their dissatisfaction with the entire institution, when she heard the voice behind her. "Was?" She turned. Gerald Foss, director of clinical operations at Callaway Bay Medical Center, was standing at the entrance to the main ER bay. He was wearing his coat over his suit, which meant he'd come in early, which almost never happened. Behind him stood a woman Nora didn't recognize. Business clothes, no hospital ID, the particular neutral expression of someone who had been brought along specifically so there would be a witness. Foss had a narrow face and the kind of permanent half-smile that people develop when they've spent years saying things that sound reasonable while meaning something else entirely. He was not a bad-looking man. He was not an unintelligent man. He was, in Nora's professional assessment, the specific kind of dangerous that comes packaged in competence, the kind that makes it easy for other people to dismiss concerns because the person raising them can't point to a single egregious act, just a pattern. "My office," he said. "Now." The woman from Bed 11 called after Nora as she walked away. "Excuse me, I've been waiting 4 hours. "Someone will be right with you," Nora said without turning around. Foss's office was on the 4th floor, which was administrative, which was carpeted and quieter than the rest of the building in the way that administrative spaces always are, as if the padding on the floor was intended to muffle not just footsteps, but the specific kind of argument that happened when clinical staff got too close to institutional policy. The woman in business clothes came in and sat down near the wall without introducing herself. Foss sat behind his desk. Nora sat across from him and did not take her coat off. "I'm going to get straight to the point," Foss said. "I'd appreciate that," Nora said. 3 separate physicians have raised concerns about your conduct on the floor, specifically accessing patient charts outside your assigned caseload, questioning attending decisions after the fact, and—" he paused, glancing at something on his desk. "Photographing clinical documentation." The last one landed with a small shock, because she'd only done it 40 minutes ago and she hadn't thought anyone was watching. Someone had been watching. "I photographed a discharge note," she said, "because the documentation was incomplete." "That's not your determination to make." "The hazmat flag was removed from a chart without notation," she said. "That's a patient safety issue. It's also potentially a compliance issue. The attending reviewed it and determined it wasn't applicable. There's no notation of that review." "Nora." He said her name the way people say names when they want to communicate that the conversation has already ended. "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think that's the respectful thing to do. This pattern of behavior, the questioning, the unsolicited chart reviews, the photographs, it creates a difficult environment. It undermines the physician's authority, it slows down the department, and frankly, it makes some of the staff uncomfortable." "Which staff?" "That's not information I'm able to share." She looked at him. He looked back. The woman near the wall wrote something down. "I'm placing you on administrative suspension effective immediately," Foss said. "You'll need to surrender your badge and building access at the security desk downstairs. HR will be in contact regarding next steps." Nora sat there for a moment. Not because she was surprised. She'd seen this coming in the way that you see a slow car crash coming, clearly enough to note that it's happening but too close to stop, but because she wanted to see if he was going to say anything else. Whether there was going to be any acknowledgement, any small, honest moment in which Gerald Foss admitted that what he was actually doing was removing the person who'd noticed the thing he didn't want noticed. He didn't. "Okay," she said. She stood up. She did not argue. She did not explain. She had learned a very long time ago in a very different kind of building that the people who most needed to explain themselves were the ones who didn't. "Security will escort you," Foss said. "I know the way out," she said. The escort was a formality that Foss insisted on anyway, which meant Nora walked through the ER in her street clothes with her personal bag over one shoulder and a young security officer named Devlin at her side, trying very hard to look like he wasn't doing what he was doing. She noticed everything on the way out. She noticed which nurses looked away. She noticed which ones watched with the particular expression that people have when they feel relieved that something bad is happening to someone else. She noticed Dr. Fenn standing near the resident's workstation with a coffee cup, who watched her pass with the composed expression of a man who'd been expecting this and was glad it was resolved. She noticed the charge nurse, Greta Holt, who had worked the ER floor for 11 years, and who met Nora's eyes for exactly 1 second before deliberately looking down at her clipboard. Greta wasn't a bad person. Greta was the kind of person who had spent enough time in institutions to understand that aligning yourself with the person being walked out was not a thing you did unless you were very confident about how it was going to end. Nora didn't blame her. She stopped at the security desk on the first floor and handed Marcus her badge. He took it with both hands, which she thought was a small, decent gesture from a decent person. "You good?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," she said. "You need a ride somewhere, or—" "I've got it," she said. "Thank you, Marcus." She pushed through the sliding glass doors and stepped back into the thin, miserable rain. She stood there for a moment, letting it soak into her collar again, and thought about what she had and what she didn't have. She had 3 weeks of photographs on her phone. She had 11 charts she'd documented by memory before this morning, because she'd suspected this conversation was coming and she'd wanted to be ready. She had the name of a federal medical compliance oversight number she'd looked up 2 weeks ago and not yet called, because she'd wanted to be sure before she made that call, and sure had kept shifting just far enough ahead of her to stay out of reach. She thought about the 19-year-old naval apprentice with the oxygen saturation of 91%, who'd been discharged and stamped no reportable incident. She thought about what that meant if it wasn't an isolated case. She pulled out her phone, not to make the call, not yet, not standing in the rain in a hospital parking lot, but to check the time. It was 7:22 in the morning. She was trying to decide whether to go to her car or to find somewhere dry to sit and think when the sound hit her. Not an explosion, exactly. Not at first. It was more like a pressure change, the kind of thing that happens in your ears and chest simultaneously. A compression that your body registers as wrong before your brain has caught up with what it means. The windows on the north face of the hospital shivered. A car alarm went off in the lot. Several birds launched off a nearby rooftop at once, which was the kind of detail that the brain registers in moments like these and then stores somewhere very specific for later. Then the sound arrived, a deep, percussive boom that rolled up from the direction of the harbor and seemed to come from below the ground as much as from the air. It rattled the glass doors behind her. It rattled her teeth. She turned toward the harbor. The sky above the waterfront, 2 miles southwest, had changed color. Not the red-orange of a movie explosion, but a dull industrial brown-gray. A thick column of smoke rising fast, heavier than normal smoke, the kind of color that meant chemical combustion rather than just heat and material. Callaway Bay Naval Research Harbor. She had her phone out before she'd consciously decided to. The emergency scanner app she'd never uninstalled pulled up the regional frequencies, and she listened for exactly 8 seconds before she understood the scope of what she was hearing. Multiple casualties. At least 40 reported in the initial burst. Chemical exposure, so type unspecified. But the scanner was already flagging the incident class as Hazmat Alpha, which was the designation for known or suspected toxic industrial compound release. Responders were requesting medical staging. The fire at the harbor was secondary. What had exploded wasn't a fuel depot, it was a research facility. And the unknown compounds in a research facility were always the more dangerous problem. She looked at the hospital behind her. Through the glass, she could already see the charge nurses' station in motion. Someone had heard it too. Someone had seen the smoke, and the department was starting to spin up in the uncoordinated way that departments spin up when they haven't received official notification yet and are going on instinct. Nora knew, with the calm and terrible clarity of a person who had seen exactly this kind of scenario before, that Callaway Bay Medical Center was about to receive more patients than it had protocols to handle. That the chemical exposure designation meant standard trauma triage would be inadequate and potentially dangerous. That someone in that building needed to establish decontamination staging before the ambulances started arriving, because if you skipped decontamination in a hazmat alpha event, you didn't just fail the patients you received, you contaminated your responders, your facility, and every subsequent patient you tried to treat. She also knew that she no longer had a badge. She stood in the rain with her phone in her hand and the smoke rising in the distance, and she made a decision in the time it took to exhale. She went back through the sliding doors. Marcus stood up when he saw her. "Ma'am, I can't let you—" "I know," she said, walking past him. "I know you can't." She went straight to the charge station and found Greta Holt still holding her clipboard, no longer looking at it, staring at the television someone had just turned on in the waiting area where a local news crawler was already reading explosion at Callaway Bay Naval Research Harbor. Multiple casualties reported. "Greta," Nora said. Greta looked at her with the expression of a person trying to calculate several things simultaneously. "You need to establish decon staging before the first unit arrives," Nora said. "The scanner is calling it Hazmat Alpha. If you process those casualties through your standard intake without decon, you're going to contaminate the department." "You're suspended," Greta said. "I know. Set up decon staging in the ambulance bay, secondary line at the east entrance. You need full PPE on anyone who touches an incoming patient until the exposure compound is identified. You have maybe 12 minutes before your first ambulance." "Nora, I know." "Greta," she kept her voice level. Steady. The specific register she'd learned to use a long time ago with people who were frightened and needed steadiness more than they needed volume. "I'm not here to undermine anyone. I'm here because people are going to die if the first responders don't come through a clean line. After you've got staging set up, call the State Emergency Coordinator at extension 4412 and request a hazmat medical liaison. That's a different number than your standard emergency management contact, and it matters." Greta stared at her. The television in this waiting room was now showing aerial footage. The smoke column was visible from the news helicopter, wide and dark and rising. "Where did you—" Greta started. 12 minutes, Nora said. "Probably less. Are you going to do it, or do you need me to find someone else?" Greta looked at her for one more second, then she picked up the phone. The first ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. By then, Nora had helped 2 orderlies she'd pulled from the break room set up a rudimentary decontamination corridor in the ambulance bay. Plastic sheeting, a shower station from the facility's emergency cache that she'd had to explain to 3 different people before they understood what she needed it for, and a staging table with PPE laid out in the correct sequence so that responders could gear up without cross-contaminating their own equipment. The EMTs who came in with the first ambulance were already showing early exposure symptoms. Lacrimation, mild respiratory distress, a slight tremor in one of them that could have been adrenaline or could have been the beginning of a neurological response. She processed them through decon first, which they initially resisted until she said, in a voice that had no heat in it at all, "If you don't go through decon right now, you're going to spend the next 4 days in an isolation ward instead of helping your colleagues. And that's a clinical fact and not a suggestion." They went through decon. The patient they'd brought in was a 22-year-old sailor with severe respiratory distress and chemical burns on his forearms and neck, the kind of burn pattern that suggested vapor exposure combined with physical contact with a condensed compound. She called out the preliminary assessment while a nurse she'd only ever worked alongside but never directly commanded scrambled to chart it, and she was halfway through directing the initial treatment protocol when she heard Foss's voice behind her. What the hell are you doing in my hospital? She didn't turn around. Establishing decontamination protocol for a hazmat alpha event, she said, adjusting the oxygen flow on the patient's mask. If you'd like to review my credentials for that, I'd recommend doing it after we stabilize the compound exposure in bed 1. You are suspended. There are at least 40 casualties incoming, and your department didn't have staging. She turned then because she needed him to hear this clearly, and she'd learned that people heard things more clearly when you were looking at them. You can walk me out again when it's over. Right now, I'm the only person in this building who knows the Hazmat Alpha protocol, and we have approximately 37 casualties still in the field. Foss's face had gone through 3 different expressions in the time she'd been speaking. She watched him land on the 4th one, the institutional calculation. The moment when a person in charge realizes that the thing they're holding on to is worth less than the thing in front of them. You're not giving orders, he said. I'm making recommendations, she said. Sir? She turned back to the patient. From somewhere behind her, she heard the sound of more ambulances. Then more. Then the distant percussion of what sounded like a military helicopter, which was unusual. Military medical helicopters didn't typically respond to civilian hazmat events unless the event was something other than civilian. She filed that away and kept working. The next 40 minutes were the kind that compress in memory. Not because they were slow, but because they moved at a speed that demands total absorption, the way water fills a container, leaving no room for anything that isn't immediately necessary. She moved between patients, between staff, between the decon station and the trauma bays, calling out observations and corrections in the same flat, precise voice, the one that carried without requiring volume, the one that cut through noise not because it was loud, but because it was always right. She heard Fenn at one point arguing with a resident about the treatment protocol for the compound exposure. He was defaulting to a standard organophosphate approach, which was a reasonable guess but was missing something in the presentation of the burns and the specific discoloration pattern she'd seen on 3 of the incoming patients that suggested this wasn't a standard class of compound. She stopped next to him. It's not organophosphate, she said. He looked at her. Excuse me? The burn pattern and the discoloration around the secondary exposure sites, that's not organophosphate. That's a halogenated solvent, probably high molecular weight. The treatment protocol is different. You're a nurse, Fenn said. I'm aware, she said. The protocol is different. He stared at her. You can verify it, she said, or you can treat them wrong and find out in 40 minutes when they don't respond. Either way, I've told you. She moved on. She didn't know if he listened. She didn't have time to wait and find out. It was somewhere in that compressed stretch of time, after the 4th ambulance, after she'd redirected 2 nurses who were about to process an undeconned patient through the main department, after she'd called out to Greta to get the burn specialist on the phone because 3 of the incoming casualties were going to need consults within the hour, that she first heard the sound of military boots on hospital linoleum. Not security, not police. The cadence was different, that particular measured rhythm that came from people who had learned to move in formation and never entirely lost it, even in civilian spaces. She was at the decon station, helping a second wave EMT out of his outer PPE layer when they came through the east entrance. A team of 6 in naval crisis response gear, not combat kit, but not standard either. The specific intermediate dress that meant they were expecting a medical environment but weren't assuming it was safe. Behind them came 2 more, and then a man in a uniform that was considerably more decorated than anyone else in the building. Tall, gray at the temples, the particular posture that comes from rank, not as performance but as habit. He was scanning the room with the systematic attention of someone doing threat and resource assessment simultaneously, the kind of look that cataloged everything in a single pass, and his scan had just landed on the decon station when Nora straightened up from helping the EMT. Their eyes met. She'd known he might come. She hadn't known for certain. The harbor was a naval research facility, which meant federal jurisdiction, which meant if the incident was significant enough, and it was, the magnitude of the explosion made that clear, someone from command would be dispatched. She'd run the calculation on who that might be, and she'd arrived at the number 2 most likely name. and the man standing across the ER bay was the number one. He didn't recognize her. Not immediately. She'd changed more than he had. More years, more ordinary life. The specific kind of aging that happens to people who have been very careful not to be remarkable. She was wearing scrubs and a borrowed PPE gown, and her hair was shorter than it had been, and she was standing in a hospital, which was not the context in which he'd known her. She watched him complete his assessment of the room and then begin moving in her direction, because the decon station was the obvious command point, and he was someone who went to the command point first. He stopped approximately 3 feet away. "Who's running your decon protocol?" he asked. Not rudely. It was a genuine operational question. "I am," she said. He looked at her, looked at the station, looked at the organized staging behind her, and the clear patient flow in the PPE station, and the documentation board she'd set up on a rolling cart from the supply room. "What's your background?" he asked. And this was the moment. Not a dramatic moment, no spotlight, no build-up. Just a man asking a nurse a professional question in the middle of a crisis, and a woman deciding whether to answer it the short way or the true way. She said, quietly enough that only he could hear it, "Cascade 4, Coordinator, 2009 through 2014. The Rear Admiral's face did not change. Not in the way faces change when people are surprised. It changed in the way faces change when something that has been filed under settled and closed suddenly reopens. A subtle shift in the eyes. A stillness that wasn't there before. "That program was classified and sealed," he said. "Careful. Level." "Yes," she said. "It was." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, his team was spreading out through the ER, and the noise of the department continued, and Greta was on the phone somewhere, and someone was crying in Bay 3, and the 4th ambulance was pulling up outside. "What's your name?" he asked. "Vass," she said. "Nora Vass." He said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "I need to see your hands." It was a recognition protocol. Old. Specific. The kind of thing that only made sense if you knew what it referred to, and nobody in this building knew what it referred to except the two of them. She held out her left hand. On the inside of her wrist, mostly obscured by a faded scar from a different kind of day entirely, there was a small marking, not a tattoo, something older and more permanent, the kind of identification that classified programs used before biometric verification existed. The Rear Admiral looked at it for 1 second. Then he did something that no one in Callaway Bay Medical Center had ever done in the direction of Nora Vass. He came to attention. Nobody in the department understood what they were seeing. The Naval Crisis Response Team had frozen mid-movement, not because they'd been ordered to, but because when a Rear Admiral comes to attention, the people around him tend to stop whatever they're doing and try to figure out why. Greta Holt had lowered the phone from her ear without ending the call. One of the residents had walked into the edge of a rolling cart and didn't seem to notice. Even the patient in Bay 2, a 40-year-old harbor worker with chemical burns across his shoulders, had gone quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when the room changes register around them. Rear Admiral Desmond Call held the position for 2 full seconds. Then he dropped it. "Get me a command point," he said to the team behind him. "Flat, operational. Southeast corner. Clear sight line to both entrances." He turned back to Nora. "Walk with me." She fell into step beside him without hesitation. They moved toward the southeast corner of the bay, and she noted, without commenting on it, that he'd chosen the exact position she would have chosen. Back to the wall, unobstructed view of all traffic flow, close enough to the decon station to monitor, but removed enough to think. "How many incoming?" he asked. Scanner was reporting 40+ when it started. "We've received 11 so far. I'd estimate another 20 to 30 in the next hour, depending on field triage." "Compound identification?" "I'm working on a halogenated solvent hypothesis. High molecular weight, vapor, and contact exposure. I flagged it to the attending on duty, but I don't know if he updated the protocol." "Your confidence on the identification?" 70%, maybe 75%. The burn pattern and the discoloration are consistent, but I'd want a toxicologist to confirm." Call nodded. He pulled a radio from his belt and spoke into it in a clipped shorthand that she partially understood and partially didn't. She'd been out of that world for a long time, and the shorthand had evolved. But the cadence was familiar, and it was enough. "There's a toxicologist on the CNR medical team," he said when he'd finished. "She'll be here in 6 minutes." "Good," Nora said. He looked at her sideways just for a second. "You've been here how long?" "Since 7:22 this morning." "When did the explosion occur?" 8:09. "So you were already here?" "I was in the parking lot," she said. "I'd been suspended 40 minutes before the explosion." A pause. Not a long one. "Suspended for what?" "Questioning chart documentation," she said. "Specifically, documentation related to a series of patients presenting with exposure symptoms over the past 3 weeks. All of them connected to the harbor facility." Call stopped walking. It was a very small stop, barely a half step, but she noticed it because she'd been watching for it. She'd been watching for the moment when the information she'd been carrying for 3 weeks would land in front of someone with the authority to do something about it, and she needed to see what it looked like when it did. "Say that again," he said. 3 weeks of patients," she said. "Low-level exposure presentations, all discharged faster than their presentations warranted, documentation flagged and then unflagged without notation. The attending physician signing off on all of them was the same doctor currently on the floor. The director who suspended me this morning knew about the chart anomalies because I brought them to him 11 days ago." Call's jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of tension that appears in faces when someone is processing something faster than they want to show. "You documented this?" "Photographs of 12 charts. Notes on 3 additional cases I reviewed from memory before this morning on my phone." He looked at her. "Why didn't you go to the federal compliance line?" "I was building the case," she said. "I wanted to be sure." "You're sure now?" She met his eyes. "I was sure 8 days ago," she said. "I was waiting to be sure enough that someone couldn't tell me I was a nurse who thought she went to medical school." Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, recognition of something he'd heard before in different words. "Who's the attending?" he asked. "Fenn. Aldrich Fenn." Call picked up the radio again. Dr. Aldrich Fenn found out something had changed in the way that people in institutions usually find out, not directly, not with a conversation, but through a series of small environmental signals that aggregate into certainty before any individual piece of information has been delivered. The first signal was that 2 members of the Naval Crisis Response Team had positioned themselves near the workstation where he normally stood. The second was that Rear Admiral Call had been in a quiet conversation with the suspended nurse for 12 minutes, and had not looked away from her once. The third was that one of the CNR team members had approached him 40 minutes into the crisis and asked very politely for his identification and his credentials documentation. "I'm the attending physician on duty," Fenn said. "Yes, sir," the team member said. "I understand that. I'm going to need the documentation anyway." Fenn handed it over. He watched the team member photograph it and walk away, and he stood very still for a moment in the middle of the emergency department that was somehow running better without his leadership than it had been running with it. And he understood that the woman he'd watched being escorted out by security 3 hours ago was the reason the room felt different. He found Foss near the administrative access corridor. Foss had appeared approximately 20 minutes after Call arrived, having come down from his office with the specific expression of a man who was trying to project authority in a room that had stopped recognizing his. "She's talking to him," Fenn said quietly. Foss glanced toward the southeast corner. "I see that." "She has documentation. She told me 3 weeks ago that she was collecting documentation, and I didn't." He stopped. "You didn't what?" "I didn't take it seriously," Fenn said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite guilt and not quite fear, but lived in the space between them. "I thought she was just—" "Don't say it," Foss said. "She knew the compound wasn't organophosphate," Fenn said. "I looked it up after she said it. She was right. How did a floor nurse know that?" Foss said nothing. He was watching Call and Nora across the department, and his face had the particular stillness of someone who is running out of moves. The CNR toxicologist arrived in 5 minutes, not 6. Her name was Dr. Sable Rourke. Compact, fast-moving, with the distracted focus of someone whose mind was always slightly ahead of her body. She went straight to the decon station and introduced herself to Nora with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no interest in hierarchy and significant interest in the problem in front of her. Halogenated solvent? Rourke said, looking at the notation Nora had written on the documentation board. Working hypothesis, Nora said. Burn pattern, discoloration, the symptom progression in the first wave patients. Rourke studied the board for approximately 4 seconds. High molecular weight polymer solvent. There's a class of compounds in the Harbor's research catalog that fits this. I've been briefed on the facility's inventory. She pulled out her tablet. They were running thermal stress testing on sealed compound batches. If the containment failed under the explosion pressure, she stopped, typed something, looked up. Your hypothesis is correct. The treatment modification you'd need is chelation support, modified respiratory protocol, and watch the renal function, Nora said. I know. Rourke looked at her for the first time as a person rather than a data point. What's your background? I'm a nurse, Nora said. Rourke held her gaze for a beat. Right, she said. Okay. She turned toward the bays. Let's update the protocol. They worked together for the next 40 minutes in a way that had nothing to do with title or credential and everything to do with the specific language of people who understand how the body fails and what to do about it. Rourke called out compound specifics. Nora translated them into clinical directives the floor staff could execute. The residents and nurses around them adapted without being asked to discuss it. They simply began following the updated protocol, the way that people in a crisis follow whoever is most clearly right. Ben stood at the edge of this and watched it happen. He updated the treatment orders when Rourke formally submitted them because he had no basis to refuse, and he said nothing. The 11th patient to come through the decon station was a 17-year-old civilian, a harborside apprentice, who'd been near the perimeter of the research facility at the time of the explosion, close enough to catch the initial vapor dispersal, but far enough that he'd tried to walk himself to the road before collapsing. He came in with severe bronchospasm, a heart rate of 134, and the beginning of what Nora recognized as a neurological cascade, the fine tremor in his hands, the confusion that went in and out, the way his eyes couldn't quite settle. She'd seen this before. Not here, not in this building, in a different building a very long time ago, in a country she was not permitted to name in documentation, and the treatment she'd improvised there had worked in a situation where working was not supposed to be possible. She pulled Rourke. The neurocascade, she said. Have you seen it progress in compound exposure of this class? In theory, Rourke said, looking at the boy. There's a documented case series from a 2011 industrial incident. The intervention window is about 20 minutes once the tremor presents. 20 minutes from first tremor, or 20 minutes from this point? Rourke checked his intake time, checked the current time. Her expression answered the question before she did. 15 minutes from now, she said. Nora was already moving. She called the orders, not suggestions, not recommendations, orders. And the nurse beside her, a young woman named Pia, who'd been working the ER for less than a year, executed them without hesitation because there was something in Nora's voice that made hesitation feel like the wrong instinct. Rourke backed every call and added 2 of her own, and between them they built a treatment approach that was technically outside the standard protocol, but was, in the specific way that mattered in this specific moment, correct. The boy's tremor slowed at the 14-minute mark. By 16 minutes, his heart rate had dropped to 112. Pia looked at Nora across the gurney with an expression that had several things in it, and Nora recognized all of them because she'd felt all of them herself at various points in a career that looked, from the outside, like it had only ever happened in this building. She didn't say anything. She moved to the next patient. To meet Sane. It was somewhere in the second hour that Gerald Foss made his mistake. He'd been circling the periphery of the department since call arrived, present enough to appear to be managing, removed enough to avoid direct engagement with the CNR team. It was a readable strategy, and Nora had been tracking it the way you track a problem you've already categorized. He came up beside her at the documentation station, where she was updating the patient log that Pia had started maintaining. And he said, in the lowered voice of someone who has decided that quiet authority is the right register for this moment, "You need to understand that what you're doing right now changes nothing about your employment status." She didn't look up from the log. "Okay," she said, "you're still suspended. You're still under review. Whatever—" He paused. "Whatever impression you're making today doesn't supersede an institutional process." "I know," she said. "Then why are you still here?" She set down the pen. She looked at him. She thought about the 19-year-old apprentice with the 91% SAT in the scrubbed chart. She thought about 12 photographs on her phone. She thought about 3 weeks of something wrong that had been easier for everyone in this building to file away than to address. "Because there are patients," she said. He opened his mouth. "Mr. Foss." Call's voice came from approximately 6 feet to the left, and both of them turned. The rear admiral was standing with his hands behind his back, and the specific quality of stillness that comes from people who have spent years in rooms where a raised voice is a sign of weakness. "I need 5 minutes." Foss looked from Call to Nora and back. Something moved through his face that she couldn't entirely read. A decision being made, a calculation completing. He straightened slightly. "Of course," he said. "My office. Here is fine," Call said. And the way he said it made it clear that here was not a suggestion, and the 5 minutes were not a courtesy, and what was about to happen in the middle of the emergency department of Callaway Bay Medical Center was not a conversation between equals. Foss knew it too. She could see it in the way his posture changed. Not dramatically, not a collapse, just a slight settling. The specific deflation of a person who has run out of room to reframe the situation. Call looked at him with the steady attention of someone who has already gathered everything he needs and is now simply completing a formality. "Tell me about the chart modifications," he said. The department kept moving around them. Pia was logging, Rourke was with a patient. Greta was on the phone at the far end of the station. Nobody was obviously listening, but in the way of all emergency departments, everyone was. Foss said, "I don't know what you're referring to." Call said, "I have documentation of 12 anomalous chart modifications over a 22-day period, all involving patients presenting with symptoms consistent with low-level compound exposure from the harbor facility, all carrying your authorization code in the administrative modification log." He paused. "You should know that the modification logs are not visible to standard staff users, but they are visible to anyone with federal system access. And we have had federal system access to this hospital's records management platform since 0912 this morning." The silence that followed was not a long one, but it had the particular quality of a silence that contains a great deal. Foss said nothing. "The Federal Medical Compliance Division has been notified," Call said. "An investigative team will arrive within the next 2 hours. Until then, I'd ask you to remain in the building and to make yourself available." He held Foss's gaze for one final beat. "Do you understand?" Foss nodded. Once. Slightly. Call turned away from him and came back to the documentation station, and Nora watched Foss remain standing exactly where he'd been for a moment longer, and then she watched him walk toward the administrative corridor with the careful, measured steps of a man who knew he was being observed and had not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. She turned back to the log. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly, because the last hour had been the kind of sustained intensity that usually left some physical residue, a tremor, a heaviness, something the body uses to mark the difference between ordinary time and this. She felt none of it, just the usual tiredness, the ordinary ache of a full shift on her feet, the slightly too bright quality of fluorescent light on a morning that had already been very long. Pia appeared beside her and quietly started re-alphabetizing the medication confirmation slips without being asked, which was either the instinct of a good nurse or the specific anxiety management of a young person who had just seen several things happen and needed somewhere to put her hands. "Is it always like this?" Pia asked. Not quite to Nora, not quite to anyone. "No," Nora said. "Sometimes it's worse." She said it matter-of-factly and meant it that way, and Pia glanced at her and then away, and then back again with the expression of someone who is trying to figure out what kind of person says something like that, and sounds like it's simply a description of the weather. The next ambulance came through 8 minutes later, and then two more in close succession, and the department absorbed them and kept moving. It was during the third of those arrivals, while Nora was at the decon station directing two orderlies in the correct removal sequence for outer PPE, that she heard the sound from the administrative corridor. Not a shout, not a crash. It was the sound of something plastic hitting the floor, a phone, or a tablet, or a coffee cup, the kind of small and ordinary sound that becomes significant because of when it happens and where. She looked toward the administrative corridor. The door was open. She couldn't see into the corridor from where she was standing, but she could see the edge of the space, and she could see that Greta Holt had looked up from the nurse's station and was also looking at the door, and that Marcus, who had come up from the security desk and was standing near the waiting room entrance because someone had told him to come up, and he'd come, because Marcus always came, was moving toward the corridor with his hand on his radio. Call was there first. He came through the door with two members of his team, and he was moving at a pace that was not quite running, but was the thing that happens before running when you're trained not to run in places where running causes panic. She finished the PPE sequence. You did not leave a decon sequence incomplete regardless of what else was happening. And handed off to the orderly, and then she walked toward the administrative corridor at a pace that was not quite running. The corridor was short and ended at the stairwell door, and Foss was standing at the stairwell door with his jacket off and his phone on the floor, which was the object that had made the sound, and he was having what appeared to be the beginning of a cardiac event. His left arm was pressed against the wall. His color was wrong. He was sweating in the specific way that people sweat when it's their heart and not their nerves. Nora came through the door, took one look, and said to the CNR team member nearest her, "Gurney, now!" She was already moving to Foss, her hand on his wrist, her eyes on his face, assessing. He looked at her with an expression that contained several things she chose not to name. "Sit down," she said. "Lean against the wall. Don't try to stand up straight. He started. "Sit down," she said again. Not harsh, not satisfied, just the voice. The flat, certain voice that had moved people to do things they hadn't decided to do yet, in rooms much more difficult than this one. He sat. She worked the assessment and called the numbers to the team member with the radio and kept her hand on Foss's wrist while the gurney came and he was transferred to it, and she rode it to the cardiac bay because that was where she needed to be. And the situation that had begun that morning in a fourth-floor office with a man who'd believed he was dismissing someone ordinary was now arranged entirely differently than anyone who'd been in that office had anticipated. The cardiac bay doors swung closed behind her, and in the emergency department outside, the log kept filling and the patients kept coming, and somewhere in the building an investigative team was 45 minutes away from arriving, carrying with them the weight of everything that had been wrong in this place for longer than anyone had been willing to say out loud. And behind the nurses' station, Greta Holt picked up her clipboard and started writing down what she'd seen that morning, from the beginning, in her own handwriting, because she had decided, not dramatically, not heroically, but with the quiet resolution of someone who had been deciding for a long time and had finally reached the end of it, that she was not going to be one of the people who looked away. Greta filled 2 pages before the federal investigative team arrived. She wrote in the tight, efficient shorthand of someone who had charted 10,000 patient interactions and knew how to compress what mattered without losing it: dates, times, the specific language Foss had used when she'd raised concerns about the bed. 11 documentation 11 days ago. The exact words Fenn had spoken in the hallway the morning after the third harbor-connected patient was discharged faster than she thought was right. She wrote down what she'd done and what she hadn't done, and she did not soften the second category because the whole point of writing it was that softening it would make it useless. She was on the 3rd page when the federal team came through the main entrance. There were 4 of them. Federal medical compliance investigators, not police, though 2 of the CNR team members flanked the entrance in a way that made the distinction feel academic. They had the look of people who traveled with preloaded questions and were not interested in context that hadn't been specifically requested. The lead investigator was a woman named Harwick. She introduced herself to call in the corridor outside the cardiac bay in a voice that didn't carry, and Nora, coming out of the cardiac bay after handing Foss's case to the attending cardiologist, caught only fragments. She caught enough. 22 incidents, not 12. She stopped. She had documented 12 charts. She had photographed 12 charts. She had thought, in the careful way she'd built the case, that 12 was thorough. The 12 was enough to establish pattern. 22 meant the modification had started earlier than she'd identified. Meant the first cases predated the one she'd found by at least 2 weeks. Meant that somewhere between the beginning of whatever had been happening at that harbor facility and the moment she'd first noticed something wrong, 10 additional patients had been processed and discharged and filed away under documentation that federal investigators were apparently already treating as evidence. She stood in the corridor and recalibrated. Call saw her and separated from Harwick briefly. He came over with the particular walk of someone who has more information than he wants to deliver in a hallway. "The federal team has records we didn't have access to at 0912, he said. "The modification pattern goes back further." "How much further?" 6 weeks. She did the arithmetic. 6 weeks ago, the harbor facility had been in the initial phase of what she now understood was a classified thermal stress testing protocol on sealed compound batches. 6 weeks ago, the exposure incidents had presumably been small enough, and the patients unremarkable enough, that no one outside the facility's internal management had flagged them as connected. "Foss knew from the beginning," she said. It wasn't a question. "The modification log access codes traced to his administrative account," Call said. "Every single entry." She thought about the morning he'd called her into his office. The woman in business clothes near the wall who had not introduced herself. She thought about the phrasing he'd used, photographing clinical documentation, and how specific it was, how it assumed without stating that she'd been looking at specific things and that specific things needed to be addressed. "The woman who was in his office this morning," she said, "when he suspended me. She wasn't HR. Call's expression confirmed it. "She was already investigating," Nora said. "She's been embedded in the administrative division for 9 days, Call said. "Hospital compliance auditor, external contractor. She flagged the documentation anomalies and was building a case through official channels," he paused. "Apparently you were building one through unofficial channels at the same time. And Foss knew about both of us." "He moved on you first because your approach was more immediately visible," Call said. "Getting rid of you was easier to justify institutionally than obstructing a compliance audit." She absorbed that. The thin rain this morning, Marcus taking her badge with both hands, the parking lot and the smell of wet concrete, and the explosion that had changed the shape of the morning. "How's Foss?" she asked. "Stable. The cardiologist is calling it a stress-induced event. Not a full infarction." She nodded. She felt nothing about that information that she could cleanly name, so she filed it with the other things that would need processing later, in a quieter place than this. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Call looked at her for a moment. "For the next 3 hours, I need you on the floor," he said. "We still have incoming casualties. We still have treatment protocols that your staff is executing better with you directing than without." He glanced toward the main ER bay. "After that, Harwick's team is going to want your documentation and your statement." "All right," she said. She went back to work. The third wave of casualties came in at the 2-hour mark, and it was worse than the first two. The field triage teams had been working through the harbor facility's outer structures, and what they were finding there was the evidence of an exposure event that had been ongoing. Not just the explosion, not just the acute release, but a slow seep from compromised containment that had apparently been present for days before the thermal stress test failed catastrophically. The workers who came in with this wave had chronic low-level exposure layered under acute exposure, which was a treatment problem of a different order because their bodies had already begun adapting to the compound in ways that made the standard intervention response unpredictable. Rourke figured it out from the third patient in this wave, a 44-year-old harbor maintenance supervisor whose symptom presentation was internally inconsistent in a way that acute-only exposure didn't account for. She brought Nora in, and they worked through it together over 6 minutes of fast, specific clinical conversation that the resident standing nearby followed about 60% of and wrote down 100% of. The modification to the protocol was not simple, It required a staged approach, treating the acute exposure first to stabilize, then adjusting the chelation approach to account for the chronic baseline, then monitoring for a rebound effect that Rourke had seen in only one prior case series and Nora had seen in exactly one prior field situation that she did not explain, but that gave her a specific understanding of the timing. If we're wrong, Rourke said, not to anyone in particular, we have about a 4-hour window before the rebound becomes unmanageable. We're not wrong, Nora said. Rourke looked at her. You sound certain. I've seen the rebound. I know what it looks like, and I know what stops it. We're not wrong. She said it not because she was performing confidence, but because she was genuinely, technically confident, which was different, and Rourke was a good enough clinician to understand the difference. She nodded once, and they implemented the modified protocol and moved on. The resident, a young man named Vasquez, who Nora had barely spoken to in 6 years of working the same department, appeared at her elbow 40 minutes later while she was reviewing the renal function results on the chronic exposure patients. Can I ask you something? He said. Quickly, she said, not looking up. The staged chelation approach you and Dr. Rourke set up, it's not in any protocol I've trained on. Where does that come from? She looked at the results. The numbers were moving in the right direction. She thought about how to answer him. From a situation where the standard protocol wasn't available, she said, and improvisation was the only option. Where was Vasquez? She said. The renal function on bed 6 is going to need a consult in about 30 minutes. Go find out which nephrologist is on call and whether they're in the building. He went. She went back to the results. It was Pia who noticed the discrepancy in the supply inventory. She came to Nora at the documentation station with a printed sheet and the expression of someone who is not sure they're seeing what they think they're seeing and is hoping to be told they aren't. The hydroxycobalamin stock, she said. It's showing available in the system, but I went to pull it, and the cabinet is almost empty. We've got maybe a third of what the system says we have. Nora took the sheet. She looked at the inventory log. She looked at the dispense records. The system showed 42 units available. The cabinet had 14. When was the last physical count? She asked. The log says 3 weeks ago, Pia said. But the last documented dispense was, she pointed, 9 days ago, 6 units, 28 units unaccounted for. In a department that was currently treating compound exposure patients for whom hydroxycobalamin was a second-line intervention in specific rebound presentations. In a shortage, if the rebound Rourke had flagged materialized across the third-wave patients, they would have a treatment gap at the worst possible moment. Nora set the sheet down. She thought about the supply modification logs. She thought about what Call had told her about the scope of what the federal team was finding. Pull every physical count on controlled and specialty medications for the past 6 weeks, she said. Everything. Don't use the system count. Do a physical check. Pia looked at her. I know how long it takes. Start now. Pia went. Nora picked up the inventory sheet and walked to where Call was standing with Harwick near the southeast corner command point. She put the sheet on the table between them without preamble. The supply manipulation wasn't limited to documentation, she said. Specialty medications are showing inventory discrepancies. I need your team to cross-check the procurement records against physical counts. Harwick looked at the sheet. Her face did not change, which told Nora that this was not entirely surprising information. We've been pulling procurement records for the past hour, Harwick said. The documentation modifications were cover for a broader diversion scheme. We believe the supply chain manipulation has been ongoing for approximately 4 months, Nora said. Harwick looked at her. How did you arrive at that number? The bed 11 patient 2 nights ago was the most egregious documentation anomaly. But the pattern I identified in the chart started showing inconsistencies about 3 weeks ago, which means the scrubbing got less careful 3 weeks ago, which typically happens when a scheme has been running long enough that the people running it have started to feel safe. She paused. People get sloppy at the 4-month mark. It's a documented pattern in institutional fraud. Harwick studied her for a moment. Is it? In my experience, Nora said. She did not elaborate on what that experience consisted of. Can you pull physical inventory, or do you need the hospital's cooperation for that? We have federal access as of 09/12, Harwick said. Then pull it. Because if the hydroxycobalamin shortage is real, I have 30-plus patients who may need it in the next 4 hours, and I need to know now if I have to source it from an alternate facility. Harwick looked at Call. Something passed between them that Nora couldn't entirely read. I'll have an inventory team in the pharmacy in 10 minutes, Harwick said. Thank you, Nora said. She turned back to the floor. She had covered approximately 6 feet when Call's voice came from behind her. Was? She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen when he came to attention. That particular quality of a man who has recalculated something significant and is still in the process of landing on the new number. The supply diversion, he said. If you're right about the scope, it's connected to the exposure incidents, she said. The documentation scrubbing protected the facility from liability. The supply diversion funded the cover-up. They're the same scheme. Call said nothing for a moment. Foss didn't do this alone, she said. He didn't have the access. He had help from inside the harbor facility's administrative structure. The Rear Admiral's expression went somewhere she hadn't seen it go before. Not anger. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. How long have you known that? He asked. Since I looked at the supply sheet, she said. 30 seconds. He picked up his radio. The hydroxycobalamin shortage was confirmed at 11 units. 11, against a potential need of 30-plus in the next 4 hours. Nora made the call to Southeastern Regional Medical, a hospital 40 minutes up the coast, while Rourke reviewed the patient list and Pia continued the physical medication audit. She spoke to the pharmacy director there with the specific efficiency of someone who knows exactly what she needs and exactly how to ask for it, and she had a transfer commitment for 20 units within 4 minutes of the call connecting. Then she went back to the floor, because the transfer commitment was not the medication, and in the time between the call and the arrival, there were still 30-plus patients who needed attention that didn't depend on what was in the cabinet. At some point in the 3rd hour, she stopped tracking the time. This was something that had happened to her before, in other high-load situations. A threshold crossing after which the individual minutes stopped mattering, and the situation became its own kind of continuous present. She moved through it the way she'd always moved through it, without drama, without the self-awareness that would have slowed her down. When a patient in Bay 8 started crashing in a way that the standard presentation didn't predict, she was there before the monitor alarm finished its first cycle, and she and Vasquez worked the correction together. Vasquez, who had spent the past hour paying the kind of attention that good residents pay when they understand they're in the presence of something they won't see in a textbook, and who called the right number at the right moment because Nora had shown him what the right moment looked like. The patient stabilized. Vasquez looked like he needed to sit down. He didn't. "How are you so calm?" he asked her. It came out more genuinely than he'd intended. Not a challenge, a real question, the kind people ask when the answer actually matters to them. She thought about it honestly for a second. "It's not calm," she said. "It's just... the other option doesn't help anyone." He looked at her. He nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they've heard something true that they don't have a category for yet. She moved on. The federal investigators had sealed the administrative wing by the time the medication transfer arrived from Southeastern Regional. Harwick's team had been in the pharmacy for 90 minutes, and the picture they were constructing, fragments of which reached Nora through call, through the controlled leak of information that happens in crisis situations when people need to understand the scope of what they're managing, was larger and uglier than even her worst estimate. 4 months of supply diversion, a connected scheme inside the harbor facility's procurement division. 3 individuals, 2 of them outside the hospital, 1 of them inside. Not Fenn, she'd misjudged that. Fenn was guilty of compliance and silence, and the specific cowardice of people who see something wrong and decide their career is worth more than the person on the other side of it. But he wasn't the architect. The architect was a procurement manager named Sutter, the same mealy-mouthed man from the billing corridor who had once told her that nurses who asked too many questions tended to find their schedules reorganized. When Harwick told her Sutter's name, she stood very still for a moment. "He told me 2 years ago that asking questions was a problem," she said. Harwick wrote something down. "He was warning you," Call said, "because you were getting close even then and you didn't know it." She absorbed that. The specific discomfort of understanding that a threat had been delivered in plain language to her face, and she had filed it under institutional politics rather than operational warning. She was not someone who made that kind of error often, and acknowledging it mattered even when there was no useful consequence to acknowledgement. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Building," Harwick said. "We have him in an interview room on the 4th floor. He's been there for about 40 minutes. "He came in voluntarily?" "He didn't know we'd pulled the procurement records," Harwick said. "He thought it was a routine incident debrief." Nora thought about that. Thought about what it meant that Sutter had walked into an interview room without knowing the records were already in federal hands. Thought about the confidence that required. The specific institutional confidence of a man who had been doing something wrong for 4 months, and watching the person most likely to notice it get escorted out of the building and had concluded that the danger was past. She thought about the 19-year-old apprentice in bed 11 with the scrub chart. She thought about the 17-year-old boy whose tremor had slowed at the 14-minute mark. She was still thinking about it when Pia appeared at her shoulder, and the expression on Pia's face was not the expression of someone coming to deliver a routine update. "Bay 14, Pia said. "You need to come." She came. Bay 14 held a patient who had arrived in the second wave, a harbor facility research coordinator named Doris Yam, 51 years old, who had been classified as moderate exposure and stabilized in the first hour. She'd been responsive and coherent when she'd come in, lucid enough to give her name and identification and to confirm her work assignment at the facility, which had been noted as administrative and not in proximity to the test site. She was not lucid now. The monitor showed a heart rate of 147 and a blood pressure of 88/54 and a respiratory rate that was climbing past 28, and her eyes were open but not tracking, and both her hands were shaking with the fine rhythmic tremor that Nora had seen before, and that she knew with terrible accuracy what it meant. But this was wrong. This was wrong because Doris Yam had been classified as administrative, low-exposure risk, stable, for 2 hours. There was no clinical basis for this presentation to emerge at this point in the treatment course unless the initial classification had been wrong, unless administrative proximity had masked actual proximity, unless Doris Yam had been somewhere in that facility that she hadn't disclosed, and the exposure she'd received was not low level, and it had been sitting inside her metabolizing into something the modified protocol hadn't been built to address. Nora checked the time. Then she checked the time against the symptom emergence. Then she checked the medication log for what Doris Yam had and hadn't received in the past 2 hours. The hydroxycobalamin transfer from Southeastern Regional had arrived 20 minutes ago. 20 units, currently in the pharmacy. If the rebound was already presenting, the intervention window was not 4 hours. It was possibly 90 minutes. It was possibly less. She called Rourke across the bay in a voice that carried without needing to be loud. Rourke came, looked at the monitor, looked at Doris Yam, looked at Nora. She wasn't, "I know," Nora said. She was closer to the test site than she told triage. "I need the toxicology panel rerun, and I need it flagged emergency priority." "That's a 20-minute turnaround at minimum." "I know. Order it and then come back here because we're not waiting for it." Rourke looked at her. "If we're wrong about the exposure level." "We're not." It was the same register she'd used before. Rourke heard it the same way she'd heard it before. She went to order the panel. Nora stood at the foot of Doris Yam's gurney and looked at the monitor and ran the calculation. She ran it 3 times because she wanted to be sure about the window, and she wanted to be sure about the intervention, and she wanted to be sure about what she was about to ask the CNR pharmacist to authorize outside the established protocol, because outside protocol requests required documented clinical justification, and she was going to have to deliver that justification in approximately the next 4 minutes, in a way that was both technically sound and fast enough to matter. Doris Yam's left hand shook. Her blood pressure dropped another point. Nora called the pharmacist. She was halfway through the justification when the door to Bay 14 opened and Harwick stepped through it, and behind Harwick was a man in a federal officer's jacket, and behind him, in the doorway, his face visible for only a second before the door swung back, was Sutter. He wasn't in custody. He was being escorted, which was different, and the distinction was visible in the way he was standing, not restrained, but accompanied, the specific posture of a man who has been asked to come somewhere and has agreed because he still believes he is managing the situation. His eyes found Nora across the bay. She was on the phone, mid-sentence, delivering a clinical justification to a pharmacist for a patient whose life depended on the next 10 minutes, and she looked at Sutter for exactly 1 second. 1 second in which she saw his expression shift from the neutral management face he'd been wearing to something else, something that had more information in it. And then she looked back at Doris Yam's monitor and finished the sentence. The pharmacist said yes. She handed the phone to Pia and looked at Harwick. "I need 60 seconds, she said. "Take them," Harwick said. Nora turned to the gurney. She had 60 seconds, and a patient who was running out of the time that 60 seconds represented. And somewhere behind her, the man who had told her 2 years ago that asking questions was a problem was standing in a doorway being escorted by federal officers. And in the next room, the records of everything he'd done were sitting in a federal database with timestamps and authorization codes, and 4 months of evidence that had no innocent explanation. She had 60 seconds, and she used all of them for Doris Yam, because that was the only thing that mattered right now, and everything else was going to still be there when Doris Yam was stable. But as Nora worked, Pia suddenly grabbed her arm, not urgently, not frantically, just a single firm grip, and said in a low voice, "The administrative corridor, there's something happening." Nora didn't stop what she was doing. "What kind of something?" "Marcus just radioed up," Pia said. "Sutter's office. Someone was in it." "Someone who wasn't supposed to be?" "Someone who shouldn't have been able to get in," Pia said. "The access code was used 4 minutes ago. Sutter has been in that interview room for 45 minutes. Nora's hands kept moving. Her mind stopped on a single point. Someone else had Sutter's access code. Someone who knew the investigation was happening. Someone who knew the federal team was in the building. Someone who had 45 minutes while Sutter sat in an interview room and decided that 45 minutes was enough time to do whatever needed to be done before the records were out of reach. She looked at Harwick. Harwick was already on her radio. Harwick was already moving before she'd finished the radio call. She crossed the bay in 8 steps and pushed through the door into the corridor with the federal officer behind her, and Nora heard the cadence of their footsteps, fast but controlled, the specific rhythm of people trained not to run, receding toward the administrative wing. Sutter was still in the doorway. He'd watched Harwick leave. His face had gone through something in the 2 seconds it took for the investigators to move, and what it had landed on was not the expression of a man who didn't understand what was happening. It was the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had just realized that the margin he'd been counting on had closed. Nora was at the gurney. Doris Yam's blood pressure had stabilized marginally, 91/58, still low, but the direction had shifted. The intervention was working, not fixed, working. She kept her eyes on the monitor and said without turning, "Pia, stay with her. Call me if the systolic drops below 85 or the tremor intensifies." "Where are you going?" Pia said. "I'll be back in 3 minutes." She moved to the doorway. The federal officer who'd been with Sutter had followed Harwick, which meant Sutter was standing in the corridor with no one between him and the exit, except a 22-year-old orderly who had no idea any of this was happening, and was pushing a supply cart past the bay entrance with his headphones in. Sutter looked at Nora. He was not a physically imposing man. He was the kind of man who had built his entire operating space out of institutional proximity, the right access codes, the right administrative relationships, the right combination of unremarkability and indispensability that let people like him stay in position for years without anyone looking too closely. He was average height and carried himself like a man who had never expected to be in a room where his average height was a disadvantage. "You should go back to your patient," he said. "I should," she said. "Who has your access code?" A pause. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your office was accessed 4 minutes ago. You've been in an interview room for 45 minutes. Someone else used your code." She held his gaze. "Who has it?" He looked at her the way he'd looked at her 2 years ago in the billing corridor. Not with contempt exactly, but with the particular dismissiveness of someone who has decided that the person in front of them is not a threat worth engaging. She'd filed that look away at the time without fully understanding it. She understood it now. "You were never just asking questions," she said. When you told me nurses who ask too many questions get their schedules reorganized. You weren't threatening me, you were assessing me. Something shifted in his expression. Small. Controlled. You wanted to know how much I knew, she said, and whether I was connected to anyone who could do anything about it. He said nothing. You decided I wasn't, she said, and you were wrong. The orderly with the headphones disappeared around the corner. The corridor was briefly empty except for the two of them and the sound of the ER bay behind the closed door. The access code, she said again. Sutter's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer, was going to hold the unremarkable man in an institutional corridor position until Harwick came back and took the conversation out of the hallway. But something had shifted in the calculus. She could see it, the specific rebalancing that happens when a person runs out of the option they'd been banking on. I didn't give it to anyone, he said. If someone has it, they got it themselves. She heard the careful precision of that sentence. Got it themselves. Not stolen. Not accessed without authorization. Got it themselves. Which implied a method and an access level that didn't require Sutter's cooperation, which meant someone with independent administrative access, someone who could pull access codes from the system without flagging, someone inside the hospital's IT structure, or above it. She turned and went back into the bay and sat. The toxicology panel on Doris Yam came back in 19 minutes instead of 20. The numbers confirmed what Nora had already known from the monitor and the tremor and the 4 years of institutional knowledge she'd built in a very different kind of institution than this one. The exposure level was not low. Doris Yam had been in the primary test corridor, not in the administrative wing, not at the perimeter, but in the interior of the research facility. At the time of the explosion, and she had lied about it in triage, possibly because she'd been instructed to, possibly because she was frightened, possibly both. Rourke looked at the panel and then at Nora. She's going to need the second intervention stage. I know, we have the transfer stock. This is going to be close. I know that too. They worked. Vasca was there, and Pia, and a respiratory tech who'd come up from the second floor when the third wave hit and had stayed because someone had asked him to stay, and it hadn't occurred to him to leave. Doris Yam's eyes found Nora's at one point during the process. Not fully lucid, not coherent, but present enough to track, and there was something in her face that was trying to be communication. You're going to be okay, Nora said. It was not a guarantee. It was a statement of intent, which was the only honest version of that sentence she knew how to say. Doris Yam's right hand moved, barely, in the direction of the table beside the gurney. Pia leaned over. There's nothing... She stopped. There's a phone. Not the standard patient belongings phone. A second phone. Small, older, the kind with physical buttons that people still carry when they want something that doesn't generate a digital footprint. It was in the folded edge of Doris Yam's jacket, which had been hung on the table hook rather than bagged because the triage team had been overwhelmed and the intake had been incomplete. Pia looked at Nora. Nora looked at the phone. She looked at Doris Yam, whose eyes were still tracking, still trying. Don't touch it, Nora said. She pulled out her own phone and called Harwick's direct number, which Call had given her 90 minutes ago. Harwick picked up on the second ring. Vass. Bay 14. My patient has a secondary phone in her personal effects. She's trying to direct me to it. A brief pause. Don't move it. I'll be there in 4 minutes. She may not have 4 minutes of coherence. Another pause. Shorter. 2 minutes. Nora kept working. The second intervention stage required sustained attention, medication timing, respiratory monitoring, the specific balance of interventions that couldn't be handed off mid-sequence without risk. She was tracking 5 things simultaneously, and the phone was one of them, and it was the lowest priority and the highest priority at the same time, which was the kind of cognitive situation that in another life she'd spent years training for. Doris Yam's eyes closed at the 90-second mark. Not critically. The monitor held steady. The blood pressure was climbing. The tremor had subsided to intermittent. She was stabilizing, but the window of coherence had closed. Harwick arrived in 1 minute, 50 seconds. which was the fastest Nora had seen a federal investigator move in a non-emergency context. She had gloves on. She bagged the phone in an evidence sleeve without touching the screen and looked at Doris Yam and then at Nora. "What was she trying to tell you?" Harwick asked. "I don't know," Nora said. "But she wasn't randomly directing me to a burner phone. She knew what was on it, and she made a decision." Harwick looked at the sealed bag. Then she looked toward the door. "The office access," she said. "It wasn't a breach." Nora waited. Whoever went into Sutter's office had legitimate administrative credentials, not Sutter's code, their own. "The system log shows an independent login, senior level." She paused. "CFO level access." The hospital's CFO was a man named Alderman Price, who had been in the building all morning and had appeared briefly near the administrative wing entrance approximately 30 minutes after call arrived. Nora had noted him in the way she noted everything. Peripherally, filed, not yet relevant. She filed it again under a different category now. "Where is he?" Nora said. Harwick's expression answered the question. They found Alderman Price in the server room on the 3rd floor. Not Nora. She didn't go. She couldn't leave the floor, and she wouldn't have even if she could, because the server room was Harwick's territory, and Call's territory, and her territory, was the ER bay, which still had 23 patients who needed her more than she needed to watch a CFO get cornered in a server room. But Call told her afterward, in the particular precise language of someone who chooses words carefully when describing institutional failures. Price had been attempting to access the procurement database, not to delete records, which was what everyone had assumed, but to export them. Specifically, to export the records to an external drive and then corrupt the source files in a way that would have been flagged eventually, but not before the exported copy was out of the building. He'd had the drive in his pocket. He'd gotten as far as initiating the export when Harwick's team came through the door. The export was 34% complete. The records it was pulling included not just 4 months of supply diversion documentation, but 18 months of procurement irregularities. A shadow procurement system operating parallel to the hospital's legitimate purchasing structure, channeling funds through 3 shell vendors to accounts that traced, through 2 layers of corporate obscurity, back to a private investment group with a financial interest in the Callaway Bay Naval Research Harbor's primary research contracts. When Call told her this, Nora sat down. Not dramatically. She simply reached the nearest chair and used it, because the scope of what he was describing required a moment of physical stillness to properly process. "The hospital was funding the harbor's cover-up," she said. "The hospital's CFO had a financial stake in the harbor's research program continuing without federal oversight," Call said. "The cover-up ran in both directions. The harbor facility managed the exposure incidents. The hospital managed the documentation. The supply diversion funded both the concealment and indirectly Price's personal investment position." She thought about Gerald Foss in the 4th floor office with his half-smile, telling her that questioning chart documentation created a difficult environment. She thought about whether Foss had known the full scope of it or had been managed by Price, kept far enough inside the operational layer to be useful, and far enough outside the financial layer to be disposable. "Foss," she said. "Did he know about Price?" "We're still building that picture," Call said. "My assessment is that Foss knew there were things he wasn't supposed to know. He made a decision about that." She understood that kind of decision. She'd worked in institutions long enough to understand the specific human calculus of a person who sees the edge of something wrong and determines that what they don't look at directly, they aren't responsible for. It was not evil exactly. It was the particular moral cowardice of comfortable people, which was its own kind of damage. "The woman who was in his office this morning," she said, "the compliance auditor. She's been interviewing Price for the past 40 minutes, Call said. She's very good." "I know," Nora said. "I figured out she wasn't HR about 20 minutes before the explosion." He looked at her. "How?" "She was writing things down," Nora said. "HR takes notes. She was taking evidence." Down. It was Greta who told her about Fenn. She came to the documentation station at the 3.5-hour mark. Greta, with her 3 pages of handwritten notes and the expression of a woman who had spent several hours deciding to be a different kind of person than she'd been at 6:47 that morning. She put the notes on the station and didn't say anything about them directly. "Ben asked me something," she said, "about an hour ago, when you were in Bay 14. He asked me if the investigators had formally issued a federal hold on the department's employment records." Nora looked at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." She paused. "He went to make a phone call after that. I don't know who he called." "Did you tell Harwick's team?" "I was going to. I came here first." She looked at the notes on the station without quite touching them. "I should have done more," she said, "earlier, before this morning." Nora considered several responses and chose the honest one. "Yes," she said, "but you're doing it now." Greta nodded. Once. The specific nod of a person accepting something without asking for it to be softened. "Take those notes to the investigator on the 4th floor," Nora said. "Harwick. Tell her everything, including what you just told me about Fenn and the phone call." Greta picked up the notes and went. Fenn was located 20 minutes later in the physician's lounge, which was on the 2nd floor and which had a landline that didn't route through the hospital's main communication log. He'd been on that landline for 11 minutes. When Harwick's team found him, he had his coat on and his car keys in his hand. He was not placed under arrest. Not yet. But the federal officer who asked him to come upstairs used a tone that made the request's optional nature theoretical rather than practical, and Fenn went upstairs and his car keys were politely held by the officer who walked behind him. The number he'd called from the landline was a law office. Nora found this out from call 40 minutes later and felt, without shame, that it was exactly the right kind of information about exactly the kind of man Fenn was. A man who, at the moment his institution was collapsing around him, thought first about his own exposure. Not about the patients. Not about the 19-year-old with the scrubbed chart or the 17-year-old whose tremor had slowed at 14 minutes. About himself. She didn't say this to call. He knew it already. By the 4-hour mark, the incoming patient flow had slowed to a trickle. The harbor site had been fully evacuated. Field triage teams had processed everyone reachable in the impact zone. The remaining casualties were structural workers and emergency responders who'd gone in after the initial explosion and come out with secondary exposure, lighter presentations, more manageable, the kind of cases that the floor nurses could handle without the modified protocols that had consumed the morning. Nora stood at the documentation board and looked at the patient log Pia had maintained. 37 total admissions from the harbor event. 3 critical cases still under active monitoring, including Doris Yam, whose blood pressure had reached 104/67 and whose eyes had opened and tracked properly for the first time an hour ago. 2 patients transferred out to specialty facilities for burns beyond what Callaway Bay could manage. 32 stable or improving. No fatalities. She stood there long enough that Vask, passing behind her, slowed and stopped. "You okay?" he said. It came out like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Tired," she said. He nodded. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the board. Then he said, "I looked up the 2011 industrial incident, the one Dr. Rourke mentioned, the one with the compound exposure case series." She waited. "There's a secondary author on the response paper," he said, "the protocol that was used in the field during the incident, before the case series was published." She said nothing. "It's listed as a consultant contribution," he said, "but the name's redacted. But the methodology note says the field consultant had prior experience with halogenated solvent exposure in a classified operational setting." He paused. "That's not a nurse." "That's not a nurse," she agreed. He looked at her. He was 26 years old, and he was going to be a very good physician. And he had just figured something out about the woman who had spent 6 years working next to him without his knowing anything about her. And he was handling the recalibration with more steadiness than most people his age would have managed. "What did you do before this?" he said. "Medical coordination," she said, "in the field." "What kind of field?" She looked at him. He held the look. "The kind with call signs," she said. He absorbed that. He opened his mouth and then closed it, which was, she thought, the right instinct. "Thank you," she said, "for Bay 8. You made the right call at the right moment." He flushed slightly, which was human and specific and reminded her that he was 26. You told me what the right moment looked like, he said. You still had to see it, she said. He went back to his charts. The Federal Medical Compliance Team finished their initial evidence collection at the 5-hour mark and established a formal hold on the hospital's administrative records, procurement database, and communication logs covering the prior 24 weeks. Harwick presented the hold documentation to the hospital's acting administrator, a vice president named Carol Mast, who had been reached by phone at her home and had arrived looking like someone who had come from somewhere nicer and was very unhappy about where she'd ended up. Nora watched this from the nurse's station and thought that Carol Mast was probably not complicit in anything, probably had the specific combination of institutional insularity and genuine surprise that characterize people who exist adjacent to corruption without participating in it, and was now going to spend the next year being interviewed about things she hadn't known and feeling, correctly, that not knowing them had been a failure of its own. Alderman Price was escorted out of the building at 4 hours and 52 minutes. Not in handcuffs, the formal arrest would come later, with attorneys and documentation and the specific procedural weight that federal cases require. But he was escorted, and the escort was visible, and the route Harwick chose went through the main ER bay rather than the back administrative exit, which Nora thought was not accidental. The department stopped when he walked through. Not dramatically, not with confrontation. It was the silence of people who recognized something important was happening and let it be important. Price walked with his eyes straight ahead and his face composed, which was the face of a man who had decided that composure was the last thing he could control. And he was probably right about that. Sutter was escorted out 14 minutes later by the same route. He did not have the composure Price had managed. His face when he walked through the ER bay was the face of a man who had spent the morning telling himself that the situation was manageable and had just run out of ways to maintain that story. He looked at the floor. He looked, for 1 second, in Nora's direction. She was at the documentation station, writing up the patient summary for Doris Yam's chart, and she was looking at the page rather than at him, because the chart was what needed attention, and Sutter's face was not information she required. She heard his footsteps pass and then recede through the east doors. It was Call who brought her the last piece. He came to the documentation station at the 5-hour and 20-minute mark and sat down across from her, which was unusual. He'd been standing all morning, everyone had been standing all morning, and the specific act of sitting communicated something about the register of what he was about to say. Doris Yam talked to Harwick, he said. Nora set down the pen. She was in the primary test corridor because she'd been directed to be there by Price, he said. She's part of the harbor facility's administrative structure. She was Price's internal contact. She managed the incident reporting within the facility, flagged which exposure cases needed to be routed to FOSS for documentation management. She was running the cover-up from the inside, Nora said. She was the mechanism connecting the harbor facility and the hospital. The cases that ended up in Callaway Bay with scrubbed charts, she selected which ones needed management and communicated that to Sutter, who coordinated with FOSS. Call paused. She didn't know about the supply diversion, she says. That's still under review. But she directed herself to the test corridor, Nora said, during the explosion. She was retrieving physical documentation, paper records of the incident routing system that weren't in the digital database. He paused. She didn't make it out before the explosion. She got caught in the vapor release. Another pause. Shorter. She still had the records on her when she came in. Nora sat with that for a moment. The burner phone that Doris Yam had pointed her toward. The phone that Harwick had taken in an evidence bag 2 hours ago. The phone, she said. Contact list and message history, Call confirmed. Every routing communication for 6 weeks. Names, instructions, timestamps. It's comprehensive. She kept it, Nora said, even while she was running the cover-up. People who keep records while they're doing things they know are wrong, Call said, and then stopped. They're planning to stop? Nora finished. He nodded. Or they're planning to have something to offer if it goes wrong. Either way, she said, you have everything. We have everything, he said. She went back to the chart. She finished the patient summary for Doris Yam in the flat, precise language of clinical documentation. which required no interpretation and no editorial and no acknowledgement of the specific irony of filing an accurate medical record on a woman who had spent 6 weeks ensuring that other people's records were not. She filed it. She picked up the next chart. It was somewhere in the 7th chart that she noticed the quality of the room had changed again. Not the crisis management change of the morning, not the investigative change of the afternoon, but something quieter. The remaining staff moving at a sustainable pace, the monitors running steady, the specific ambient sound of a department that is handling what it has rather than drowning in it. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, without making a show of noticing it, without needing it to mean anything beyond what it was. She was reading the 8th chart when Greta came back from the 4th floor. She sat down beside Nora without preamble, in the same chair Call had used, and put her hands flat on the documentation station table. Harwick's team found something else, Greta said, in the administrative records. Nora looked up. A second suspension file, Greta said, predated, filled out but not submitted. It has your name on it. It was created 14 days ago. Nora was quiet for a moment. Foss was planning to suspend me 2 weeks before he did it. There's a note attached, Greta said. From Price, it says, she stopped, recalibrated. Delay until the compliance audit timeline is clear. We may need her suspended before or after, depending on what the auditor surfaces. The room was steady around them, the monitors, the footsteps, the ordinary controlled hum of a department that had survived its morning. Nora set down the chart she was holding. She had been suspended not because she'd become a problem on the morning Gerald Foss called her into his office. She had been suspended on a schedule, timed against an investigation she hadn't known was happening, managed against a financial scheme she'd only partially understood, her removal coordinated between a hospital director and a CFO with a personal stake in a naval research program, calibrated to the day and possibly the hour. She had been a variable in someone else's equation. And the reason she'd survived being a variable in someone else's equation was that she had spent 6 years in this building being precisely and consistently the thing they'd underestimated her for. The nurse who read every chart, who noticed the thing that didn't fit, who asked questions that made people uncomfortable, who had a memory for dosages and a voice that carried without volume and a history that nobody in this building had thought to look for because people like her weren't worth looking for. She looked at Greta. Thank you, she said. Greta nodded. She looked like she had more to say and wasn't sure whether to say it. She decided to. I'm sorry, she said, for this morning, at the nurse's station, when I know, Nora said. I should have. Greta. She said it the way she said most things, level, without performance. You're writing it down now. That's what matters. Greta nodded again. She stood up and went back to her station. Nora sat with the document in front of her and the knowledge it contained and let herself feel, for exactly the length of time it took to exhale slowly, everything that she had been holding at arm's length since 7:22 that morning. Then she picked up the chart and kept working. She was still working 40 minutes later when Marcus appeared at the nurse's station. Not the security desk Marcus, who'd handed her badge back, but the night shift Marcus, who was technically not supposed to arrive for another 2 hours, and had apparently come in early because the radio traffic had filtered down to the security desk, and he'd wanted to know what was happening. He looked at the department, at the CNR team still stationed near the exits, at the evidence tape on the administrative corridor entrance, at the 2 uniformed federal officers standing near the elevator. He looked at Nora. Hell of a morning, he said. It was, she said. He studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but the specific recalibration of a person who is seeing someone they thought they knew and realizing the image needs updating. You going to be okay? He said. I'm fine, she said. How are you? He laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh. You get suspended, the harbor blows up, you somehow run the whole crisis response. Half the administration gets walked out by federal agents. He shook his head. And you ask how I am. You're here early, she said. That matters. He stopped laughing. He looked at her with the uncomplicated directness of a man who didn't have a complicated relationship with the truth. Who are you? He said. Not dramatically, not rhetorically. He actually wanted to know. She was about to answer, the short answer, the one she'd been giving all day, when Call appeared at the corridor entrance with Harwick beside him, and a third person she didn't recognize, a woman in a military dress uniform, not Naval Crisis Response but Administrative Command, with the specific insignia of the Naval Inspector General's office. The woman looked across the department and found Nora with the precision of someone who had been told exactly where to look. She walked toward the nurse's station with Call and Harwick flanking her, and when she reached it, she did not extend a hand or offer pleasantries. She said, "Ms. Vass, I'm Inspector General Soren Quayle. I've spent the last 3 hours reviewing the classified operational records from the Cascade 4 program." A pause. "I need to ask you about a series of field decisions made in 2012 that are now directly relevant to a federal obstruction case, because the person who has been coordinating the suppression of your personnel file for the past 11 years is not Gerald Foss." The department continued around them. The monitors ran steady. Marcus stood very still behind the security desk. Nora looked at Inspector General Quayle and waited. "It's someone you reported in 2014, Quayle said. "Someone who has been in federal administrative positions ever since. Someone who has had your sealed identity flagged for monitoring." She held Nora's gaze. "Someone who knew you were here." The name Quayle gave her was Reginald Mort. Nora didn't react visibly. She had trained herself, a very long time ago, not to react visibly to things that warranted visible reactions, because in the environments where that training had happened, visible reactions were information you couldn't afford to give away. But something moved through her chest that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition and not quite the specific cold clarity of understanding. It was all three simultaneously, arriving at once and requiring a moment to sort. Reginald Mort had been a Deputy Director of Defense Logistics Coordination in 2014. He had been the person she'd reported, the person whose financial arrangement with 3 private contractors, an arrangement that had cost the lives of 2 field medics who'd gone into a situation with inadequate supplies because the supply manifest had been falsified for profit. She had documented and submitted through the Cascade 4 program's internal reporting channel, which was supposed to be sealed and which had apparently not been sealed enough. She had known, when she retired under a sealed identity, that Mort had not been prosecuted. She had not known why. She had filed it under things she couldn't control and built a life that didn't include looking back, because looking back was how people in her situation stayed stuck in situations that were supposed to be finished. He had not been stuck. He had moved. Upward, sideways, through the specific fluid motion of institutional men who knew how to reframe their proximity to failure as someone else's failure. He was now, Quayle told her, in the flat informational tone of someone delivering a briefing rather than a revelation, a senior advisor to the Federal Defense Medical Oversight Division, a position with budget authority, a position with access to classified personnel files, a position from which a flagged, sealed identity could be monitored for 11 years without anyone outside the monitoring knowing it was happening. "He knew you were at Callaway Bay," Quayle said. "He's been aware of your location since you were placed here under the sealed assignment. When the harbor incident reporting started generating federal attention 6 weeks ago, your name appeared in the preliminary field assessment as a potential witness asset, a standard notation, routine procedure. His office received a copy." "He contacted Price," Nora said. 3 weeks ago, Quayle confirmed. "We have the communication records. He directed Price to accelerate the documentation cleanup and to remove you from the building before the federal investigation reached a point where your testimony would be sought." Nora thought about the predated suspension file, the note from Price that said delay until the compliance audit timeline is clearer. The calibration of her removal against an investigation she hadn't known was happening, managed from an office she hadn't known was watching. "Where is he now?" she said. "Federal custody as of 40 minutes ago," Quayle said. "His office was secured simultaneously with the hospital search. He was not in his office. He was at a private facility 2 hours outside the city. He'd been there since this morning." A pause. He knew the harbor explosion would trigger federal response. He knew that federal response would reach this hospital. He had prepared to be unavailable. "But he didn't know I was still in the building," Nora said. "He thought you'd been removed before the explosion," Quayle said. The timing of your suspension, relative to the explosion, was a margin of 40 minutes. He calculated you'd be gone. 40 minutes. The thin rain and the parking lot and the pressure change in her ears and the birds leaving the rooftop all at once. He was wrong about the margin, Nora said. By 40 minutes, Quayle said. Yes. Marcus was very still behind the security desk. Call was watching Nora with the expression of someone who has known part of this story for a long time and is now watching the rest of it arrive. Nora looked at Quayle. What do you need from me? A formal statement covering your 2014 report, the chain of events that led to your sealed placement, and everything you observed and documented in this hospital over the past 3 weeks. Quayle held her gaze. The Mort prosecution requires a primary witness with direct knowledge of the original report. The documentation you submitted in 2014 was filed but suppressed. We have it. It was recovered during the current investigation, but a suppressed document without a living witness who can authenticate it and testify to its chain of custody is a weaker case than we want. You want me to testify, Nora said. I want you to have the opportunity to finish what you started 11 years ago, Quayle said. It was carefully phrased, not pressure, not quite an ask. The specific language of someone who understood that the person across from her was not someone who responded to pressure and was offering something else instead. Nora looked at the documentation board behind the nurse's station, at the patient log Pia had maintained in her careful handwriting, at the 37 names on it, one of which was a 17-year-old boy whose tremor had slowed at 14 minutes. Yes, she said, I'll testify. The formal statement took 4 hours the following morning, in a conference room on the 4th floor that smelled faintly of the evidence team's equipment and the remains of someone's cold coffee. Quayle conducted it with a federal attorney present and a recorder running and the specific unhurried thoroughness of an investigation that knew it had what it needed and wanted to build it correctly. Nora answered every question in the same register she used for everything, level, precise, without editorializing. She described the 2014 report. She described the sealed placement. She described 3 weeks of chart anomalies and 12 photographs and a compliance auditor she'd identified by the way she took notes. She described the morning of the explosion and everything that had followed it, in sequence, without emphasis, because the facts were already emphatic enough and adding anything to them would have been redundant. When it was done, the federal attorney looked at his notes for a moment and then looked at her. Ms. Vass, he said, I've been doing this for 19 years. I have rarely seen documentation assembled with this degree of precision by someone operating without institutional support. I was a nurse, she said. We document. He smiled at that, just slightly. Yes, he said. You do, bad. The prosecutions moved with the specific speed of federal cases that have overwhelming evidence and significant public interest. Not fast by ordinary standards, but steady, one procedural step after another, each one documented and verifiable and resistant to the kind of quiet unraveling that had protected Reginald Mort for 11 years. Mort was formally charged 6 weeks after his arrest. The charges covered the 2014 supply manifest falsification, the deaths of the 2 field medics, the 11 years of illegal monitoring of a sealed civilian identity, and the coordination of a witness suppression scheme that connected him to Price and Sutter and the Callaway Bay Harbor fraud. His attorney released a statement describing the charges as politically motivated. The statement was noted and ignored by everyone who had read the evidence. Price entered a plea in the 8th week. His cooperation agreement required full disclosure of the investment structure connecting him to the harbor research contracts, which unraveled the Shell vendor system and produced 3 additional defendants from the harbor facility's administrative structure, including the procurement director who had been the third party in the original supply diversion scheme. The investment group that had funded the cover-up was dissolved by court order. The assets connected to it were frozen pending civil litigation from the harbor workers and their families. Sutter did not cooperate and did not enter a plea, and was convicted at trial 11 months later on 7 counts of evidence tampering, fraud, and patient endangerment. The patient endangerment count was the one that Nora thought mattered most, because it was the one that named the 19-year-old apprentice from Bed 11 and the 17-year-old boy and Doris Yam and 21 other people whose exposure had been managed and minimized and documented into invisibility while real harm accumulated in their bodies. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Foss was not prosecuted for the supply diversion. The evidence placed him as a knowing participant in the documentation scheme rather than the financial one, which was a meaningful legal distinction even when it felt like a thin moral one. He lost his administrative license. He lost his position. The investigation's findings were made part of the public record, which meant that his name and his decisions were visible to anyone who looked permanently without the institutional buffer that had protected him for years. He did not contest it. Fenn's case resolved in the way that cases like Fenn's often resolve, not with prosecution, but with consequence. His medical license was suspended pending a review board investigation into patient safety violations. The review board took 7 months and produced a finding that his conduct had fallen materially below the standard of care in a manner that endangered patient outcomes. His license was not revoked, but was restricted and conditioned on a 2-year supervised practice period. He appealed. The appeal was denied. Whether any of that was enough was a question that Nora did not have a clean answer to, and she didn't pretend she did. Doris Yam recovered fully. It took 6 weeks and a transfer to a specialized treatment facility for the later stages of the compound exposure recovery, and it was not a comfortable 6 weeks by any clinical measure. But she recovered. She also cooperated fully with the federal investigation, which the federal attorney noted in his closing argument at the Sutter trial as a material contribution to the prosecution's case. The burner phone with 6 weeks of routing communications had been the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. The federal attorney said this to Nora directly at a brief meeting 2 weeks before the Sutter trial in the same conference room on the 4th floor. "She could have let it go," he said. "When she was in that corridor during the explosion, she could have dropped the phone and walked away and kept her name clean." "She kept it instead," Nora said. "People who keep records of the things they're doing wrong," he said, and then paused, and she recognized the echo of what Call had said in the ER bay. "Are planning to stop," she said, "or are building an exit." "In her case," he said, "I think it was both." Callaway Bay Medical Center's acting administrator Carol Mast signed the formal reinstatement of Nora's employment in the 4th week after the explosion, under conditions specified by the federal investigation's oversight requirement and the state medical board's concurrent review. The reinstatement was retroactive, which meant the suspension was removed from Nora's employment record entirely. The formal letter described the suspension as issued without basis and rescinded in full, which was accurate and which used the specific administrative language that would follow Gerald Foss's name in any future institutional inquiry involving Callaway Bay. Mast also, in the same meeting where she signed the reinstatement, offered Nora the newly created position of Clinical Safety Director, a role that had not existed before and that Mast described with the careful language of someone building a policy from scratch. The position carried oversight authority over documentation standards, clinical protocol compliance, and incident reporting chains. It reported directly to the administrator rather than through the medical director structure. It had a staff of 4. Nora thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it not because she was uncertain, but because she'd learned over many years that decisions made without enough thought tended to need revisiting, and she preferred not to revisit decisions. She accepted. Not because it was recognition, though it was. Not because it meant she'd been right. She'd known she was right since the morning she photographed the Bed 11 discharge note, and validation from an institution was not the thing that made her right. She accepted it because the problem she'd identified was real and was larger than documentation scrubbing, and the position gave her the tools to address the system rather than its symptoms. Because 18 months of procurement irregularities existed because nobody in the building was structurally positioned to see across the silos where they were hiding. Because the 17-year-old boy and the 19-year-old apprentice and Doris Yam and 21 other people existed in a record that said no reportable incident, and the only way to ensure that record didn't describe someone else's chart in 2 years was to change the structure that made it possible. She accepted because there was work to do, and she was the person who knew how to do it. Call came back to Callaway Bay once, 6 weeks after the explosion, On a Tuesday morning when the department was quiet and the sun was doing something reasonable with the harbor-facing windows. He found her at the new documentation station, relocated and reorganized under the clinical safety director's first operational overhaul, and he sat across from her in the chair that had become, by informal convention, the chair where serious conversations happened. He had a folder. He set it on the table between them. "The Cascade 4 program records," he said. "They've been formally declassified as part of the Mort prosecution. The field coordinator role you held, it's in the public record now." He paused. "Your name is in the public record now." She looked at the folder, not at the contents, at the folder itself. The specific physical object that represented 11 years of being a name in a sealed file and a nurse who asked too many questions. "How do you feel about that?" he said. It was an unexpectedly human question from a man who usually spoke in operational language, and she recognized that he was making a deliberate choice to ask it. "Like it's about time," she said. He nodded. "The Inspector General's office is establishing a new field medical oversight protocol based on the Cascade 4 operational methodology. The response framework you implemented here during the harbor incident is being used as the primary case study." He looked at her steadily. "They're calling it the VAS protocol." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't name it," he said. "I know," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Ask me in a year," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He stood. He picked up the folder and left it where it was. "The records are yours," he said. "They were always supposed to be." He walked toward the exit. At the bay entrance, he stopped, and without turning around, he said, in the particular voice of a decorated officer who has spent a career not saying unnecessary things, and has decided this one is necessary, "You saved 37 people yesterday. You also saved 2 field medics in 2012 who would have died if you hadn't modified the supply protocol on site. And you saved an investigation that would have stayed buried if you hadn't been the kind of person who reads every chart." He paused. "Just so you know." He walked out. Nora sat with that for a moment, with the folder on the table and the morning light on the windows and the ordinary sound of the department doing what departments do. She thought about the specific arithmetic of being told, at 53 years old, about the weight of things you'd done without anyone watching. She didn't think it was enough to account for 11 years of sealed identity and a parking lot in the rain and a bag over one shoulder and a borrowed PPE gown, but she also didn't think accounting was the point. The point was what you did with the next day. Pia found her at the nurse's station an hour later, which had become the informal version of a check-in since the explosion. Pia would appear with the medication count or a charting question, or sometimes nothing in particular, and they would talk briefly, and it was the specific kind of brief that meant something without requiring either of them to name what it meant. "Can I ask you something?" Pia said. "Yes," Nora said. "When you were in the parking lot before the explosion, did you think about just leaving?" It was a genuinely curious question, not a loaded one. Nora considered it with the same honesty she brought to clinical assessments. "Yes," she said. Pia looked at her. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Nora thought about the thin rain and the umbrella she'd never retrieved and the smell of wet concrete and the pressure change that had preceded everything. She thought about what the honest answer was, stripping away the version that sounded like a lesson and finding the thing underneath it. "Because I knew something was wrong," she said. "And leaving doesn't change what you know." Pia was quiet for a moment. She stopped. "I don't think most people would have come back." "Some wouldn't," Nora said. "Some would." She looked at Pia. "You stayed all night during the third wave. You maintained the patient log for 7 hours straight without being asked. You noticed the hydroxycobalamin shortage before I did." Pia looked at the floor, slightly. The way people look at the floor when they're not sure what to do with being seen accurately. "That's not the same," Pia said. "It's exactly the same," Nora said. "It's just smaller. Most of what matters is smaller." She handed Pia the day's protocol update and went back to work. The Mort sentencing took place 11 months and 12 days after the explosion at Callaway Bay Naval Research Harbor. Nora attended as a witness and as herself, not under a sealed identity, not as a floor nurse who asked too many questions, but as the person the public record now said she was. The courtroom was quiet, in the way courtrooms are, with the specific weight of institutional proceedings that know they're resolving something that took too long to reach this room. Mort received 16 years. The judge's statement noted specifically and on the record that the 11-year suppression of a sealed identity represented an abuse of federal administrative authority that had endangered a civilian's safety, obstructed justice, and delayed accountability for the deaths of 2 service members whose families were present in the courtroom and had been waiting, the judge said, long enough. Nora did not watch Mort's face when the sentence was read. She watched the 2 families in the gallery instead, a woman who had been a field medic's wife and was now a field medic's widow, and a man who had been a field medic's brother and had driven 4 hours to be in this room for this hour. She watched their faces when the judge finished speaking and the number 16 landed in the air of the courtroom. She would not describe what she saw on their faces as relief, because relief implied the end of something, and what she understood about those families was that 11 years of waiting didn't end in a courtroom. It shifted. It became a different shape. But it was still there, and it would always be there. And the most honest thing she could say about what the sentence meant was that it was the thing that needed to happen, finally, and it had happened. And that mattered even when mattering wasn't the same as fixing. Outside the courthouse, in the ordinary afternoon light of a city going about its business, she stood on the steps for a moment and let herself feel the specific weight of a day she had been working toward for 11 years without knowing that was what she was doing. Then she picked up her bag and went back to the hospital, because there were charts to review and a new protocol implementation to check, and a meeting with MAST at 4 o'clock about expanding the Clinical Safety Director's reporting authority to include the outpatient division. There was work to do. There always was. The quiet ones, the ones who read every chart, who ask the questions that make people uncomfortable, who show up in the parking lot in the rain and go back through the door anyway. They don't do it because they expect to be thanked. They do it because they know something, and knowing something carries its own obligation, and that obligation doesn't wait for permission or recognition or the right moment. It just waits for you to stop walking away. Nora Vass walked back through the sliding glass doors of Callaway Bay Medical Center on a Tuesday afternoon in ordinary light, and Marcus, who was on the early shift and had been watching for her, said good morning even though it was well past noon, because that was what he always said. And she almost smiled because that was what she almost always did. And the department opened around her and took her in.